So for this session, we will look into another more specialized application, much like we did with reinforcement learning in the morning and plasticity. Now we will look into decision making, and we will build a circuit that actually does decision making in a behavioral task. Now, a bit of some history notes on the decision making research, and particularly we will deal with perceptual decision making now, with tasks that have to do with evidence accumulation over time, and participants, be it humans or animals, having to decide whether this perceptual stimulus belongs to one category or another. Typically there are two categories, but you can have tasks with multiple possible answers in any perceptual modality, right? So, and the distinction between these perceptual decision-making tasks and the previous tasks that we saw, category learning, is that with decision-making, and particularly the perceptual decision-making, the categories are known a priori, right? So participants don't need to learn by feedback which category is the correct one. They just need to tease apart any ambiguity in the perceptual stimuli by accumulating more and more evidence over time to reaching a conclusion about this stimulus seems to be of the category A or B. And I'd like to talk to you about one family of models that essentially started the boom in modeling decision-making tasks or perceptual decision-making. That is the drift diffusion family. You might have heard of models like that. So with drift diffusion models, we will to go over them. How do they look? What's the mechanisms around them, and what are the first principles that actually guided their creation? And then we'll also look into the random dot motion task. This is a very popular behavioral task, purely perceptual again. And then we will also move on to the circuit model. That's the same model that we will be building. It's quite a popular model. That's why we picked this one from this Wang paper at 2002. It can actually capture the evidence accumulation dynamics that the behavioral DDM exhibits, and it has some excitatory population and one inhibitor population. And as you will see, it also has a flavor of this winner-take-all motif, but in this case, the structure is more of an abstraction over biology. This network is not very biologically realistic, but it just gives us some nice properties because it captures behavioral results, and it can also explicitly model different receptors, as you will see. Now, starting with the drift diffusion model, so as I was saying, there are some principles behind it, and you can find mathematical derivations of it, or the mathematical proof for this trade-off that I'm claiming here. That with the drift diffusion model, it can optimally negotiate this trade-off between accuracy and speed, which means that if we ask the model to be of a specific accuracy level, then it would be we can tune it to be the fastest model that reaches that accuracy level. By fastest, I mean taking the least amount of time gathering evidence before making a decision. Or if we want a model with to respond at a fixed amount of time and likewise a fixed amount of evidence, then it can be the most accurate model. And essentially, the model mechanism, you can see a graphic of this here. There's always some starting point in between two decision bounds, right? And we have this process that is, well, the combination of a drift process with with some tendency to go either up or down, and some diffusion, some additive noise on top of that, right? So you can think of it as a particle moving across space until it reaches one of the two bounds, right? And whichever bound it reaches, it makes that decision, right? So this is the case of a binary decision-making task. So let's say that the upper bound is left choice and the lower is right choice. And you can see colored here are all the free parameters that we can use, right? The starting point can represent any bias that the participant might have, any tendency towards one category or the other. And this is particularly useful when you vary the reward that they might get from one choice over the other. Drift is the rate by which they accumulate evidence. The bound separation, that's another free variable that represents, the amount of information that, a person or an animal needs to make a decision. But there's also the non-decision time, and here we can account for any amount of the response time that is not the participant thinking about what they choose. This can be, the typical explanation for this is motor execution, right? So because we make a decision in our minds, but then it might take some few hundreds of milliseconds to actually execute that decision. So we can account for that time as well, and tease it apart from the actual response time. And now moving on to the experiment that you will model in a sense with a circuit. It's the random dot motion task, right? Where essentially a participant sees this pool of dots as they move in space inside this aperture, and they need to decide essentially what direction the dots move towards, right? Again, binary choices. The dots move either on average towards the left or the right. And as the experimenter, you can vary the level of coherence between dots, right? Which goes from 0% coherence, so all dots move randomly, to some, let's say 50% value, where as you can see, half of the dots move towards, the correct direction that is right, and then 100% coherence is, this is very clear. So, and this is a very typical mechanism in perceptual decision-making task, right? Because if the reward feedback is always the same, then the challenge comes from, and there is no learning, right? The challenge comes from telling apart perceptual stimuli. So you play around with this ambiguity, and you can see how subjects participants, be it animal or humans, actually resolve this ambiguity over time. Moving on to the actual model that you will work on with the exercises. So this is a schematic of the model. Essentially, there are two excitatory populations, A and B. Each one is selective for one category, but there is also some non-selective neurons here, also excitatory, around this pool. But now the difference is that the two selective populations also receive specific inputs to them, right? Representing any input from upstream regions that might signal, the one choice being correct over the other. So this is essentially visual stimuli coming in, represented as IA or IB. And there's also the interneuron population here. Of course, we always need this, feedback between some excitatory populations and some inhibitory ones, as you saw in previous days. And the interneurons actually project to both of these populations and to the non-selective excitatory neurons in here. And on top of all this, there is some background noise, or some background spike trains that represent, upstream regions that we're not explicitly modeling. We'll just model them as Poisson spike trains coming into all of these neurons. So now here I also include the numbers from the original model, from the Wang paper. We will use a reduced, scaled down essentially version of this circuit. But as you can see, the scaled down version can still exhibit this the competition, right? And one of the two populations winning, either A or B, and a decision being made, just by adding some scaling factors to the model parameters. So, and essentially, as I was saying, there is a selective currents coming into each neuron, right? The IA and then IB, and we can, as you can see here, essentially the two currents coming into neurons for a level of coherence that is that is 0. So this is almost this is why there is so much overlap between the two currents. But for instance, for a level of coherence of 6%, you can see the two currents are actually split apart. And here we'll see the distribution of all potential current values for IA and IB, because the current coming in is stochastic. So we assume that it comes from a normal distribution, and we essentially set both the mu value and the sigma, so both the mean and the standard deviation of that normal distribution. So as you increase the coherence more and more, those two normal distributions will come further and further apart, essentially. So the currents will be more and more different. So decisions will be easier to make. And I just want to show you the model equations in order to highlight the fact that this model explicitly includes receptor dynamics in it. So the first equation is just a typical, voltage gradient, right? And it includes this synaptic current, right? And the synaptic current has 4 terms in it. One of them is just the external input that's coming in that is representing the visual stimulus. So we assume that that is an AMPA current. But of course, there is also some recurrent AMPA currents from other excitatory neurons projecting to each neuron. There are recurrent NMDA currents, likewise from other excitatory neurons. And there is also GABA currents coming in from the interneurons, right? And you can see the equation for each current. There are simpler ones in most cases, except for the NMDA, which has a bit more complicated dynamics. And also, respectively, you can see the gradients for the synaptic gates, right? So each neuron has a voltage gradient, but it also has these synaptic gradients modeling AMPA, NMDA, and GABA explicitly. So this is what I was saying initially. This model is not the most biologically realistic because it assumes this all-to-all connection, right? So the excitatory populations are connected to one another in a dense manner and within the neurons in a dense manner, and you don't really see this density, high density in actual brain circuits. But it's a viable model because it can actually highlight the importance of receptor dynamics and individual receptor dynamics in the process of evidence accumulation and decision making. And you will play around with the receptor values, and you will see how the decision-making behavior changes. So these are some more results from the paper that you could replicate with the exercises. So on the right here, we see different coherence levels, starting from 50% going down to an incoherent stimulus. But even in the incoherent case of 0%, as you can see, these are populations, say A and B, right? Both populations begin firing in a similar manner, but after a while, especially this second dark line here, one of them will win over. So this one wins, and the other one, slowly fades away. A similar behavior to what we saw before with winner takes all, and with the ping model as well. And this behavior is even more pronounced with higher coherence, right? Because with higher coherence, it's clearer to see from early on which one is winning, right? Because it also receives a higher current to begin with. So yeah, again, the same population can win more easily at 50% coherence compared to 0%. And on the right here, we see some essentially summary statistics of this behavior. We see some response time distributions, which are always a useful metric, especially when you have a perceptual decision-making task, when the participants are free to respond. And you can also see some more psychophysical curves, right, when the accuracy varies over coherence values. And yeah, this is another typical result from behavioral studies. You can feed sigmoidal curves on it and use their parameters to maybe organize your participant into subpopulations, or to do population level statistics between, say, a control group and any test group that you have. So yeah, this was the end of it. So feel free to navigate from the course to the decision-making section, and then open the decision-making notebook. And yeah, as always, feel free to ask any questions that you might have. So, thanks.